All right, folks, we've been talking about fairy tales and we've talked about the elements that fairy tales generally have. Magic, threes and sevens, good versus evil, talking animals, and royalty. We said they don't have to have all of these things, but they're generally going to have some of them, probably several of them. Now, the fairy tale I want to read to you today is one that you may have never heard of before because I can't think of any Disney cartoons or movies that have been made based on this particular fairy tale. The fairy tale is called Hansel and Gretel, and it is a German fairy tale, which you may have noticed from the names, Hansel and Gretel. As I read it, see if you can notice these features. Here we go. Hansel and Gretel. Once upon a time, in the forest, there lived a man and his two children, a boy named Hansel and a girl named Gretel. They had very little to live on, and once, when there was a dreadful season of famine in the land, the poor woodcutter could not earn enough money to buy the food that they needed each day to live. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, the parents sat together talking about how difficult things were and what in the world they were going to do. The poor husband sighed and said to his wife, who was not the mother of the children but their stepmother, "What will become of us? For I can barely earn enough money to feed the two of us, much less the children. What will we do for them? For they will surely starve." "I know what to do, husband," said the woman. "Early tomorrow morning we will take the children for a walk into the forest, and when we get into the deepest, darkest part of the forest, we'll leave them there and come home. And then you and I can work and take care of ourselves without having to worry about the children." "No, I could never do that. How could I have the heart to leave my children out in the woods? They'd be devoured by wild beasts." "Oh, you fool," said the stepmother. "If you refuse to do this, you know that all four of us will starve to death. At least this way we can live." After that, she wouldn't let him have any peace, until finally he was worn out and couldn't sleep, and he would lay awake at night thinking about his poor children and what in the world he could do for them. The two children, who were also too hungry to sleep, heard all that their stepmother told their father. Poor Gretel began to cry. But as she cried, her brothers said, "Don't worry, Gretel. I have a plan to take care of us." As soon as it was quiet, Hansel went out into the yard and gathered up as many pebbles as he could put into the pockets of his jacket. Then he went back to his sister and said, "Don't be afraid, little sister. Sleep in peace. Heaven will take care of us." And then he lay down in bed and slept until the morning. As soon as the sun came up, the stepmother woke up the two children and said to them, "Get up, you lazy bones, and come to the woods with me to gather firewood." And then she gave each of them a piece of bread and said, "You must keep that to eat for your dinner. Don't argue, because you'll have nothing else." Gretel took the bread and put them both pieces into her pocket, because Hansel's pockets, of course, were full of pebbles. The stepmother led them a long, long way into the woods. And as she led them, Hansel would stop every few feet and drop a pebble out of his pocket to leave a trail. "Come, children, let's gather firewood, and I'll make a fire, for it will be very cold here." As soon as Hansel and Gretel had piled up a big pile of brushwood, the woman set it on fire and said, "Sit down here, children, and rest for a while I go to work with your father, cutting wood in the forest. When we've finished our work, we'll come and get you, but it won't be until late this evening, so you must wait a long while for us." Hansel and Gretel sat by the fire, and when noon arrived, they ate their piece of bread, which the stepmother had given to them. And they waited and waited and waited, thinking that eventually someone would come for them, but no one did. So finally, they fell asleep. When they woke up, it was very dark, and Gretel began to cry, "What will we do to get out of this wood?" But Hansel said, "Don't worry. As soon as the moon comes up, we'll follow the trail of pebbles I've left and find our way home." And so they did. As soon as the moon came up, and the moonlight was shining on the pebbles that they had left. They followed their trail and made it back home. When they knocked on the door, their stepmother opened it and said, "You naughty children, why have you been so late getting back from the forest? We thought you were never coming back." Their father was overjoyed to see them, but it grieved him in the heart to think that they had been left alone in the forest. Not long after this, things got even worse, so they barely had enough food to even eat one meal a day. And the stepmother said to the father, "These times are getting even worse. We have barely half a loaf of bread left to feed us all. And when that comes to an end, there's nothing left. The children have to be sent away. We'll take them deeper into the forest this time, and they won't be able to find their way home at all." But the husband felt very sorry at heart, because he thought it would be better to share the little bit of food that they did have left with the children than to just leave them out to starve. But his wife wouldn't listen. And as soon as he gave in, she decided to go to work immediately before he changed his mind. The children were awake, of course, and had heard this conversation. And as soon as the children knew that the parents were asleep, Hansel got up again, just like he had the last time, to gather pebbles. But he found this time the door was locked, because the stepmother had figured out what he had done. Early the next morning, she came and woke them up, pulled them out of bed early, told them to get dressed, and gave each of them a half a piece of bread, smaller and dirtier than the last piece was, and took them out into the woods. As they walked, Hansel, who had the bread in his pocket, would break off a crumb and drop it on the trail, just like he'd done before with the pebbles. As soon as they were deep into the forest, the stepmother helped them to pile up a pile of brushwood and lit it on fire and said, "Remain here, children, and rest while I go to work with your father cutting wood in the forest. You may lie down and sleep for a while, and we'll come and fetch you in the evening when your father has finished his work." The children stayed there till midday, and then Gretel shared her tiny piece of bread with her brother. They lay down and slept for a while, and as soon as it was night, they woke up, expecting to use the moonlight to follow the breadcrumb trail back home. But to their shock and surprise, all the breadcrumbs had been eaten by little birds and little mice and other little creatures, and they realized they were completely and hopelessly lost in the forest. Gretel began to cry, but Hansel tried to hide his fear and said to her, "Cheer up, Gretel. We'll find our way home somehow." And they began to wander about the forest. But to their disappointment, they didn't come out of the forest to their home. Instead, they ended up deeper and deeper in the forest and more lost than they had been to begin with. About noon, they saw a beautiful snow-white bird sitting on a branch of a tree and singing so beautifully that they stood still to listen. When it finished its song, it spread its wings and flew on before them, and the children followed the bird until at last, in the distance, they saw a small house, and the bird flew to the house and perched on the roof. You can imagine how surprised Hansel and Gretel were when they came nearer to the house and realized it was made of gingerbread and decorated with cookies and treats, and the window was made out of sugar. "Oh," said Hansel, "let's stop here and have a feast. I'll eat the sugar window. I'll bet it tastes nice." Hansel reached up on his tiptoe and broke off a piece of the gingerbread roof and sat down and began to eat because he and Gretel were very hungry. Presently, they heard a voice call out from inside the cottage, "Munching, crunching, munching, who's eating up my house?" The children answered, the wind, it's only the wind." And they went on eating like they had been before, because it had been a long time since they had had a full belly. Hansel, who found that the roof of the house tasted very good, broke off another large piece and handed it to Gretel, who had just taken out a whole pane of the window that was made of solid sugar and seated herself down to eat, when the door suddenly flung open and a strange-looking woman came out leaning on a stick. Hansel and Gretel were very afraid, and they dropped the food immediately out of their hands. The old woman shook her head at them and said, "Ah, you dear children, who's brought you here? Come in and stay with me for a while, and no harm shall come to you." She seized them both by the hands as she spoke and led them into the house. She gave them a supper that night with plenty to eat. She gave them milk and pancakes, sugar, apples, nuts, and when evening came, they both slept in the most beautiful little beds you'd ever seen, with white curtains, and they lay down and felt like they had died and gone to heaven. But although the old woman pretended to be friendly, she was in fact a very wicked witch. And she had built her house of gingerbread and cookies and candy on purpose so that she could entrap little children. When she had them in her power, she would fatten them up and then eat them up. Fortunately, the witch had very weak eyes and could barely see at all, but she had a very good sense of smell, just like a wild animal, and she could easily discover when people were nearby. As Hansel and Gretel had come near to her house, she had smelled them in the distance and said, "I'll have them now, and they'll never escape again." Early in the morning, before they were awake, the old woman was up, standing by their beds and looking at how beautiful and fat and rosy they looked, and she muttered to herself, "Oh, what tasty tidbits they will be." Then she grabbed Hansel with a rough hand, dragged him out of bed, and led him to a little cage in the corner and shut him in there. He screamed as loud and as much as he could, but it was totally useless. After this, she went to Gretel, yanked her out of bed, and said, "Get up, you lazy brat, and draw some water so I can boil something good for your brother who's locked up in a cage until he gets fat enough to eat." When Gretel heard this, she began to cry, but it was useless, and she had to do what the wicked old witch told her. For poor Hansel, breakfast was the best of everything, but Gretel was just given scraps to eat. Every morning the old woman would go to the cage and say to Hansel, "Now hold out your fingers so I can feel how fat you're getting to be." But Hansel was far too clever for this, so instead of holding out a finger, he would hold out a skinny little stick he had found at the bottom of the cage. And every day the witch would feel this and say, "You're as thin as you've been." And she'd feed him even more to try to fatten him up. "Go, Gretel, go get some more water. I've got to feed your brother, because pretty soon, fat or lean, I'll eat him up." Oh, poor Gretel cried and sobbed as she pulled the water out of the well for her brother. "I would have rather been eaten by wild beasts or starved to death than to be here with this wicked old witch." "Stop your crying, you silly girl. It's of no use. No one can help you now." Finally, a day came when the witch decided that, lean or fat, she was going to eat Hansel right away. So she had Gretel to fill a big pot of boiling water. As soon as this was done, the old woman said, "First we'll bake some bread. I've made the oven hot, and the dough is already kneaded." Then she dragged poor Gretel up to the door of the oven, where the flames were burning so brightly and so fiercely that Gretel broke into a sweat just from the heat. "Creep over there and see if the oven's hot enough to bake your brother and your bread." But if Gretel had obeyed her, the old witch intended to shove Gretel into the oven and cook her up too. Gretel, however, was as smart as her brother, and she had guessed what the wicked old witch intended to do. So she said, I don't know how. I don't know how to get into the narrow little door of the oven so I can see if it's hot enough." "You stupid girl, the oven's big enough for me to get into. Just look, I'll show you." As she spoke, she stepped forward, opened the door of the oven, and stuck her head in. As quick as a wink, Gretel shoved the wicked old witch into the oven and shut the door tight. Then, as quickly as she could, she ran to Hansel, opened the door of the cage, and said, "Hansel, Hansel, we're free. The wicked old witch is dead." He flew out of that cage just like a bird. And the two of them hugged and kissed each other with the greatest love and joy. Now that they had nothing to be afraid of, they looked around the old witch's room and found an oak chest, which they opened and found it to be full of pearls and gold and jewels. "These are better than pebbles," said Hansel, and he filled his pockets with as many as he could carry. "I'll carry some home too," said Gretel. She held out her apron, and she filled it up as full as Hansel had filled his pockets. "We'll go now and get away as soon as we can from this enchanted forest." They were walking for nearly 2 hours before they came to a large piece of water. Where should we go now? We can't go across and there's no bridge, said the boy. Oh, look, here comes a boat, said Gretel, but she was mistaken because it wasn't a boat, it was just a white duck that came swimming toward the children. Perhaps the duck will help us across if we ask, said Gretel. Little duck, do help poor Hansel and Gretel. There's not a bridge or a boat. Will you let us sail across on your back? The good-natured duck came near to the bank as Gretel spoke, so close indeed that they could have jumped onto him if they wanted. But the duck said, No, you'll all be too heavy for me. I'll have to take you across one at a time. The good duck helped them, carried Gretel over first, and then came back for Hansel. And the children were so happy because they now found themselves in a part of the forest that they recognized, and they knew their way home from here. So they ran as fast as they could to their house, and bursting inside, they threw themselves into their poor father's arms. The poor old man had not had a moment's peace since his children had vanished into the forest, and he was overjoyed to finally have them back again. And now they had nothing to fear, for the wicked old stepmother who had taken them out into the woods to die had herself starved to death. But how surprised the poor old woodcutter was when Hansel and Gretel opened up their pockets and their apron to show him the pearls and the coins and the precious stones that they had. And Hansel drew handful and handful out for his father, and the father and his two children never had to worry about starving again, and they all lived happily ever after. The end. Now, let's see, did we see any of the elements that we said we would find in a fairy tale? Of course, we saw good versus evil, the stepmother who wanted the children to starve to death, and also the wicked witch who planned to eat them. Did we have any magic? Absolutely, we had a wicked witch. What about royalty? No, there were no kings and queens in this story. Did we have any talking animals? Yes, we had the duck that talked to them at the end. What about threes and sevens? Well, the children were taken out to the woods twice, not 3 times or 7, and they had 3 main characters when they got into the woods. The old woman, the witch, and the 2 children, but I can't think of any other 3s or 7s. But I have noticed that almost always, actually in every story we've read so far, we have had good versus evil. So I think we can probably safely say this is always going to be in a fairy tale. These other things, maybe, probably, certainly some of them, but the good versus evil, the good guy against the bad guy is probably always going to be in a fairy tale. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this story, and I hope that you come back tomorrow for another one. Bye.